Amateur lovers. The opposite of meretricious can be found hidden away in the game of tennis, where the true nature of love can also be discovered. But first, a brief note on the word tennis. It's not called that, you know. The proper term for the game played at Wimbledon is Forsyth. The rules of tennis as we know them were set down by a man called Major Walton Clopton Wingfield back in the 1890s. Tennis had been played before, of course. Shakespeare refers to the game several times, but it had always been played by kings and princes in the courtyards of palaces. It wasn't until the invention of the lawnmower in the 19th century that people were able to play on lawns. Major Walton Clopton Wingfield wanted to distinguish his new game from the old tennis, which came from the French word tenez, which means hold. So he lighted on the name Svaristika, which is ancient Greek for ball skill. Svaristika became wildly popular, but there was one hitch: nobody knew how the hell to pronounce it. Did it rhyme with spike and stari stike, or with piquet? In fact, it rhymed with sticky, but nobody knew that. So rather than make fools of themselves by getting it wrong, people just decided to call it lawn tennis, and to hell with Major Walton Clopton Wingfield and his Greek. Wingfield did keep the scoring system of the old tennis, though, and it's there that we may find the true nature of love. You may have heard that love in tennis is a corruption of the French l'œuf, meaning the egg, because an egg looks a bit like a zero. This is a myth. Love is nothing, because those who do something for the love of it do it for nothing. For example, people either marry for money or connections, or for love. Love therefore became a synonym for nothing, because if you do something purely for love, you get nothing. By 1742, this notion of love being zero had taken across to games and sports. In fact, the first known reference is to the score in whist. Love in tennis is therefore the exact opposite of prostitution. It's a celebration of the amateur. Amare is the Latin for love, from which we get amiable, amorous, and paramour. And if you were doing something for your paramour, you wouldn't charge for it, would you? As late as 1863, a man could still write that he was not an amateur of melons, which simply meant that he didn't like them. The distinction between amateur and professional is merely a distinction between those who love what they do and those who do it because they are paid. Unfortunately, this means that all lovers are rather amateurish. They can't help it. It's built into the etymology. Love is much better than money. You should be afraid of money. That's what money means. Dirty money. Money is a monster, etymologically speaking. It all comes down to the Latin word monere, and even though the connection is accidental, it probably is still significant. Monere was Latin for warn, and if you have a premonition, you are forewarned. In the ancient world, they believed that horrible beasts were omens of disasters. The idea was that just before the fall of an emperor, or the loss of a great battle, centaurs, griffins, and sphinxes would come out of wherever they were hiding and roam around in full view. These unnatural creatures, composed of the parts of other animals, were therefore called warnings, or monsters. Monstrum, from monere, warnings. However, if you need a warning and can't afford a centaur, geese will do just as well. People still keep geese to guard because they kick up such a fearsome racket if they spot an intruder, and they can also be pretty vicious. You should never say boo to a goose, not unless you're prepared for a fight. The Romans kept guard geese on the Capitoline Hill. This came in useful when Rome was attacked by the Gauls in 390 BC. So useful, in fact, that the Romans put up a temple in Thanksgiving. But being ungrateful sods, they didn't dedicate it to geese, they dedicate it to Juno, the goddess of warnings, or Juno Moneta. Next door to the temple of Juno Moneta was the building where all the Roman coins were produced. In fact, the coins may have been made in part of the temple itself. Nobody's quite sure, and the sources are rather vague. What is certain is that the coin-producing building got named after the temple. It was called Moneta, and although we've changed all the vowels, we still call such a building a mint. In the Moneta, they produced moneta, literally warnings. The French took the word and dropped the T so that it was already money when it arrived in English. It keeps the reference to the temple and the angry geese alive and well. It's only by accident and propinquity that money's a monster. Perhaps you shouldn't worry about it at all. Money's not that bad. You shouldn't be so frightened. Go on, take out that death pledge. Oh, sorry, mortgage. Death pledges. Anyone who's ever taken out a mortgage will be unsurprised to learn that it is literally a death pledge. However, it's the sort of thing you would only usually notice if you were taking out a mortgage on a mortuary. Mort is death, and mortal man has nothing else waiting for him. Nothing is certain in this life except death and mortgages. The reason a mortgage is called a death pledge is that it can die in two ways. You can pay off the whole thing, in which case the deal dies and you own your own house. However, that happy ending is far from certain in these troubled and impoverished times. The only other possibility is that you fail to make a payment, the deal dies, and your house is repossessed. The whole thing was spelt out in mortifying terms in the Institutes and Laws of England in 1628. It seemeth that the cause why it is called mortgage is, for that it is doubtful whether the or will pay at the day limited such sum or not. And if he doth not pay, then the land which is put in pledge upon condition for the payment of the money is taken from him for ever, and so dead to him upon condition, etc. And if he doth pay the money, then the pledge is dead as to the tenant, etc. There are a lot of hidden deaths in English. Many people will have noticed the similarity between the words executive and executioner. But what have the two got in common? Is it that an executioner is just somebody who executes the sentence, just as an undertaker is somebody who undertakes to bury you? No. The original legal term for execution was execute to death, from the French exécuter à mort, if you execute the sentence until they die. Another hidden mort comes in the word caput. Monks used to remind themselves of their own mortality by contemplating a skull. This was called a death's head, or caput mortuum. And the original owner of a caput mortuum was definitely caput. It's enough to make you scream blue murder, which is direct translation of the French phrase mort bleu, which is itself a non-blasphemous form of mort Dieu, or death of God. The gauge in mortgage is much more cheerful. It means pledge, and is exactly the same gauge as you find when you fall in love and get engaged. It's also very closely related to waging war. Wagering war. You can't really wage anything other than war. You can try, but it sounds rather odd. Indeed, the phrase waging war gets stranger the more you look at it. Does it have anything to do with wages, or wage disputes, or maybe freeing the wage slaves? There's a connection between all these different wages, and indeed to wages, but you have to go back to the 14th century. The wage was originally a pledge or deposit. Wage is simply a different way of pronouncing the gauge in mortgage and engagement. A wage is something given in security. And from this wage you quite easily get to the modern wager. It's merely the stake or deposit thrown down by a gambler. It's also reasonably simple to see how money given in security could end up meaning money given as pay. But waging war, that involves trial by combat. In medieval law, it was considered quite reasonable to settle a legal dispute by duelling to the death. Though somebody had to die in this system, there was no guarantee of justice. Lawyers' fees were at least kept to a minimum. A wronged medieval man would throw down his gage, or wage, or pledge, and challenge his opponent to trial by combat. In Latin, that was vadiare duellum. In French, it was gager bataille. And in English, you waged, or pledged yourself to, battle. Not war, battle. It was, after all, a technical legal term for the violent resolution of individual arguments. You wagered your body in mortal combat. However, it's easy to see how the sense of waging battle extended to the promise of violence to the act of violence. In the end, when two countries couldn't agree, they started waging war against each other. This last shift in meaning could reasonably be described as wage inflation. Strapped for cash. Why are people so often strapped for cash? Being strapped for cash is actually a good thing. If you're falling down and you need something to hang on to, a strap is good. If you fall overboard, it's a good thing if somebody throws you a strap. And if you've fallen from the ship of solvency and are drowning in a sea of debt, then you very much want somebody to throw you a strap. Of course, it means that you're currently in debt, but to be strapped for cash is better than having no cash at all. Oddly, the same metaphor has been invented twice. These days, when a bank is about to go bankrupt, the government throws them a lifeline. This means that the bank survives, although they are still strapped for cash. Incidentally, bank comes from an old Italian word for bench, because moneylenders used to sit behind a bench in the marketplace from which they would do their deals. If a moneylender failed to make good on one of his arrangements, his bench would be ceremonially broken. And the old Italian for a broken bench was banca rotta, or bankrupt. So fast bucks and dead ones. So almost every form of money involves death, danger and destruction. A frightened word lover might start to wish that the stuff had never been invented at all. It is, after all, possible to run a society without any money. America, which is now the land of the fast buck, had no money until European colonists arrived. Well, almost. On the coasts of the northeast they used clamshells, called wampums, that could be threaded together into necklaces, and in Mexico they used cocoa beans as a standard by which to barter. But the point essentially stands. There were no coins, no notes, no green and folding pictures of presidents. This presented a problem to those colonists who wanted to trade. The natives looked on coins and banknotes with a mixture of scorn and confusion. What they meant to do with that? You couldn't wear it around your neck. You couldn't even make a nice cup of cocoa with it. Early attempts at trading involved tobacco. Tobacco made a lot more sense than coins. With tobacco, the peace pipe could be pulled out, and if you combined it with the cocoa beans of Mexico, you might feel almost civilized. But of course, tobacco needs to be weighed out, and it's rather bulky. The harvests go up and down, causing sudden inflation and deflation, and you need a warehouse to store it in. So the traders eventually gave up on tobacco and moved to another staple item that everybody knew and valued: deerskins. A deerskin can be slapped over the saddle of a horse. It's thin and light, and when you're not spending it, you can use it to keep warm. Buckskins soon became the standard unit of barter in North America, and a standard unit of barter is in effect money, so it was buckskins, or bucks for short, that were used for trade. With this in mind, let us turn to Conrad Weiser, the first man ever to make a buck. He was born in Germany in 1696, but his family, being Protestant, were forced to flee to Britain in 1709. There they were held in a refugee camp just outside London, before being sent to populate the colonies on the Hudson River. In 1712, when Conrad was 16, his father took the rather extraordinary step of sending his son to live with the Mohawk tribe for half a year. Conrad learnt the language and the customs of the Iroquois and started an illustrious career as a diplomat for the British among the native tribes of America. Despite having 14 children, Conrad still found the time to negotiate most of the significant treaties between the British and the disgruntled tribes and convince them that their real enemies were the French. In 1748, Conrad was sent into Ohio to negotiate with the tribes of the Five Nations. His mission had several purposes. One was to make peace and seek amends after the murder of some colonists. In this he succeeded, and the tribal council told him that what was done we utterly abhor as a thing done by the evil spirit himself. We never expected any of our people would ever do so to our brethren, the British. We therefore remove our hatchet, which, by the influence of the evil spirit, was struck into your body, and we desire that our brethren, the Governor of New York and Onas, may use their utmost endeavours that the thing may be buried in the bottomless pit, which is one of the earliest references to burying the hatchet. The next item on the agenda, though, was rather more tricky. It involved rum. Specifically, it involved a request that the British would stop selling rum to the Ohio Indians. To this, Weiser replied that you never agree about it. One will have it, the other won't, though very few. A third says we will have it cheaper. This last, we believe, is spoken from your hearts. And here they laughed. Your brethren, therefore, have ordered that every cask of whisky shall be sold to you for $5 in your town. And if a trader offers to sell whisky to you and will not let you have it at that price, you may take it from him and drink it for nothing. And that's the very first reference to a buck as a unit of American currency. The deal was then finalised with a belt of wampum. This was good news for American trade, but bad news for the American deer. However, it was all about to get much worse for the American buck. Not content with their skins, the Americans were about to make a phrase out of their horns. The buck stops here. You might assume that passing the buck has something to do with passing a dollar to the person next to you. This is not so. After all, passing a dollar would hardly shift responsibility to someone. The only thing that these two bucks have in common is a dead deer. Not, of course, that you pass the whole animal. That would be ridiculous. The phrase to pass the buck simply involves another part of the buck's corpse. Deer don't have a good time in language. Their entrails are put into pies. Their skins are used in lieu of currency. One of the few parts of the buck deer that remains is the horn. Waste not, want not. A buck's horn makes a very pleasant looking knife handle, and a knife has many uses. You can cut up venison with a knife, or you can skin another deer and make a fast buck. You can also use a knife to mark the dealer in a game of poker by stabbing it into the table in front of whoever currently has responsibility for handing round the cards. This isn't done much by people who value their furniture, but in the Wild West, life and woodwork were cheap. And the first reference to passing the buck comes from the diary of a border ruffian during the fight for Kansas in 1856. On approaching a place called Buck Creek, he says that we remembered how gladly we would pass the buck as at poker. This is odd, because the dealer usually has a slight advantage in poker. However, among the border ruffians of the Wild West, the dealer probably stood a good chance of being shot. As if you suspect there's cheating going on, the dealer is the first chap you should murder. So bucks were passed without cease until the 1940s, when they finally stopped in a prison in El Reno, Oklahoma. The prison governor had decided that all responsibility ended with him. He dealt, and the prisoners received. So he had a sign put up in his office saying, "The buck stops here." Of course, the buck didn't really stop there. The prisoner governor had to answer to the state government, and then to the federal government, and then to the president, with whom the buck would grind to a final and undeniable halt. This point was not lost upon an aide to Harry S. Truman, who visited the prison and saw the sign. He liked it so much that he had a replica made. He gave it to President Truman, who put it up in his office and made the phrase famous. So are all bucks really deer? Almost. Back to Howth Castle and environs. So the humble buck deer is the source of all things buck, with one exception, buckwheat, which looks like it should be the wheat that bucks eat, but has nothing whatsoever to do with deer. The leaves of buckwheat look very similar to the leaves of a beech tree. The German for beech is Buche, and so buckwheat is really beech wheat. Beech trees were important to the ancient Germans. Beech wood is thick-grained and not splitty, and to use woodworking terminology, so it's easy to carve things in it, and that's exactly what the Germans used to do. Beech, Buche, or Bock, as it was called in Old High German, was the standard material for writing on. Even when wood was finally overtaken by the newfangled invention of parchment, the Germans kept the name, and so did the English. Bock became Bock and became book. This is a book. The glorious insanities of the English language mean that you can do all sorts of odd and demeaning things to a book. You can cook it, you can bring a criminal to it, or if the criminal refuses to be brought, you can throw it at him. You may even take a leaf out of it, the price of lavatory paper being what it is. But there is one thing that you can never do to a book like this. Try and how you might, you cannot turn up for it, because a turn up for the books, that takes us back to page 1.